How can my faith provide comfort in death? That's the question of faith that we're asked to reflect upon this morning. And I wanted to begin with this remarkable faith declaration of our Reformed Christian forebears who boldly confessed Jesus Christ as the only comfort in life and in death. In his remarkable work, The Courage to Be, theologian Paul Tillich sought to understand the big picture of death's influence on us. For Tillich, the human being is subject to three central fears: the fear of fate and death, the fear of guilt and condemnation, and the fear of emptiness and meaninglessness. Death, condemnation, and meaninglessness. These are the three big anxieties of human existence, and each is connected to our experience of our own mortality. So I'd like to divide up my reflection this morning into three parts, sparked by these three readings, to think about how our faith addresses those three big fears associated with death. First, the fear of death, and those beautiful words from the Apostle Paul in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians.
Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put an imperishability, and this mortal body must be on immortality. When this perishable body puts on imperishability, and this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?
In George Seaton's 1956 film, The Proud and the Profane, the steps of a young nurse are traced to Iwo Jima, where her husband had been killed in World War II. She goes to the cemetery where her husband has been buried, and she turns to the caretaker who witnessed her husband's death. The caretaker is a shell-shocked soldier, and she asks, "How did my husband die?" He says, "Like an amateur." They teach you how to hurl a grenade and how to fire a mortar, but nobody teaches you how to die. There are no professionals in dying. The weeks following my mother's death, I had this strange feeling stalking me. I felt strangely disembodied, unbalanced, rootless, a bit dizzy on my feet. It took me a lot of prayer and reflection and conversation, particularly with my siblings, until I recognized that my grief had attached itself to the feeling that I was untethered from the earth, from my own life. Because my mother was no longer in this world, the body that brought me into this life was gone. Somehow my connection with the earth, even with my own life, felt unsteady, at risk. That's an absurd thought, I know, but that's the unsettling power of death at work in us. And such irrational thoughts and feelings, we're all amateurs when it comes to dying, even if only experiencing it secondhand. Maybe you've had similar thoughts or experiences, not the same as mine, but equally unsettling. You live your life as if there are some things that are constant, that can never change, that you can always count on, but death snatches that away from us. Again and again, death reminds us that this life isn't permanent. And rather than having everything in our own control, we feel buffeted by the fates, by the times and tides out of our grasp. I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That's a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. So said British astrophysicist Stephen Hawking in an interview a few years ago. for those of us yearning for comfort in our fear of the unsettling power of death, such a statement from such an admirable source can send us a chill down our spine. Certainly, Stephen Hawking could never be accused of being short on courage, having lived with a crippling disease since he was 21 years old. Nor could we accuse him of being short on imagination. He was able to imagine a collapsing sun producing such an incredible gravitational force that not even light photons can escape its dark grasp. But of course, I must point out that just like you and I, Dr. Hawking is an amateur when it comes to dying and when it comes to the afterlife. Paul reminds us in Romans that ear has not heard, nor eye seen, nor human imagination envisioned what God has prepared for those who love the Lord. The afterlife, in fact, is beyond human imagination, no matter whose imagination it is. You might be able to imagine a black hole, but that still doesn't mean you can imagine life after death. Like Paul in our reading from 1 Corinthians 15 this morning, what we know about the afterlife and the actual physical mechanics of the resurrection is not much. And our reflections on it call for open-minded listening, earnest testimony, heartfelt poetry. A clergy colleague tells the story of asking a notoriously liberal bishop if he actually believed in the resurrection. "Believe it?" he answered incredulously. "I've seen it too many times not to believe it." I don't know what exact shape it takes, but we can all testify to the fact that there is life after death because we've all seen it. We've experienced it again and again. We've seen medical miracles, even experienced them ourselves. We've heard the testimony of those who have glimpsed another side, a further shore, another world. We felt the presence of those long gone back among us, offering us guidance, comfort, loving presence. We have seen people left for dead, seemingly beyond all hope of redemption, have their lives turned around and transformed. We have felt so heartbroken by disappointment and grief that death seemed like a permanent shroud of despair gathered around us. But day followed day, step followed step. We put one foot in front of another. We lifted food to our lips. We began interacting with the faces of concern around us. And a month, 6 months, a year later, we realized that we had come to life again. What happens after death? Life. Life happens. That's the miraculous power of the resurrection that has been set loose among us through Christ, right here on earth, right in the midst of our day-to-day deaths and struggles. This is how Paul ends his long 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, talking about life after death. He says, "Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Don't give up, Paul is telling them. Don't give up on life, even and especially in the face of death. Even when things are falling apart and dying, the present power of the resurrection will hold you up, will hold us together, will continue to build something marvelous out of us. Now let's turn to our gospel reading.
Some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man brother dies, shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first married, and when he died, left no children. And the second married the widow and died, leaving no children. And the third likewise. None of the 7 left children. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had married her." Jesus said to them, "Is not this the reason you are wrong, that you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the story about the bush, how God said to him, 'I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob'? He is God. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong."
As Paul Tillich reflects on the three great anxieties of human existence, fear of death, fear of condemnation, and fear of meaninglessness, he believes that an emphasis on each roughly corresponds to the history of the Western world. At the end of ancient civilization era, at the time of Jesus, the central fear of human existence was the fear of death. You can see why this became such fertile ground for the seeds of the resurrection. At the end of the Middle Ages, the primary concern of human existence was the fear of condemnation. Will I be saved or will I be damned? That was the preoccupation of the culture and the church, with its focus on heaven and hell, sin and damnation, devils and angels, indulgences, and churchly rites of absolution. And for Tillich, it was the Reformation that countered this preoccupation with its emphasis not on judgment, but on grace, freely given by God to deliver us from the fear of damnation. Perhaps you know the story of the lawyer who died and was sent to St. Peter at the pearly gates, and Peter greeted the lawyer with the good news that the admission policy for heaven had gotten quite liberal over the years, and now was to the point where we're just looking for any kind of good deeds that you've done and we'll welcome you in. So tell me, what are some of the good deeds that you've done in your life? And the lawyer paused and thought about it, and he had to pause even longer and think about it. In fact, he thought for 2 whole days, until finally on the third day, he came to St. Peter and said, "I just remembered there was this one time where this homeless guy was bothering me and I gave him 50 cents to leave me alone." So now it was St. Peter's turn to think about this. So he gathered together with some of the other saints, and they thought about this, about what would happen to this lawyer. For 2 whole days they thought about it, and on the third day they called the lawyer before him, and St. Peter said, "I've got good news and I've got bad news." And the lawyer said, "What's the good news?" And St. Peter said, "You're going to get your 50 cents back." Well, that's our fear of condemnation. The Christian church spent so much time consolidating its power through guilt and condemnation that it's not surprising that humans should have developed such an acute anxiety about death and judgment. Even now, it's interesting to ask at the funeral services that you attend, how many of those clergy seem to think that the central question they must answer at that service is whether or not the deceased has been saved. We seem to think that whatever the resurrection might bring, it will surely be based on our criteria of salvation or damnation. What a different thought Jesus brings about in our gospel reading when he poses this hypothetical about a childless woman who was widowed 5 times, each time with another brother. This ridiculous scenario concludes with a question for Jesus: to which one of the 5 brothers will the woman be married in the hereafter? None of them, Jesus says. There is no marriage in heaven. Unsurprisingly, I've never had a wedding service where this has been offered as the passage. Though the traditional vows do quote this by talking about "till death do us part," don't they? Jesus' answer may feel a bit chilly to you, reminding you that none of our earthly institutions, marriage, church, family, nation, none of them are worthy of eternal status. And behind it all is the thought that the resurrection will not memorialize what we have put in place. It's about transforming us into a new community, the kingdom of heaven, the new Jerusalem, not judged but changed, not condemned but remade. In this way, there is no condemnation for us in Christ Jesus. We need not fear death's judgment, but we will indeed be changed, all of us, into the community God has always created us to be. What's shocking about Jesus is that he's convinced that we can start that changing right now, right here on earth, as we are still alive on this side of the resurrection. Rabbi Harold Kushner, in his bestseller, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, tells about a Chinese mother whose son dies. She goes to a holy man and asks for a magic potion to bring her son back to life. The holy man says that for such a potion to work, she needs to bring him a mustard seed from a home that has never known sorrow or grief. So she sets out to find such a seed. She goes from house to house, asking if that home has known sorrow or grief. Regardless of where she goes, whether the house is a mansion or a tent, a shack, a ranch house, wherever she goes, every house has known some sorrow and grief. As she hears people tell of her losses, she thinks to herself, who better to help these grieving people than I, who have lost my son? So she spends a time in each home listening and helping those who have loved and lost. She never finds the mustard seed. But soon it no longer matters. Her loss and she herself have been transformed in a way that enables her to help others.
When Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel.
The fear of death, the fear of condemnation, and now the fear of meaninglessness. Two women were meeting again after many years at their 50th high school graduation. This is the first time they had seen each other since graduating. One asked the other, "You were always so ambitious in school. Did you manage to live a successful life?" "Oh, yes," said her friend. "My first marriage was to a millionaire. My second marriage was to an actor. My third marriage was to a preacher. And now I'm married to an undertaker." And her friend asked, what do these marriages have to do with a successful life? He said, well, you know, 1 for the money, 1 for the show, 3 to get ready, and 4 to go. We like things nice and neat, don't we? We like a beginning, a middle, and an end. We like to set goals and meet them, to check off the things on our list. But in real life, it doesn't work out that way. The Old Testament reading this morning brings us a story from real life. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. The writer of Deuteronomy tells us about Moses' condition when he died. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. These might be the most beautiful words said at death, this side of good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. And just as Moses began with God on a mountain, so Moses' life ends on a mountain with God. On Mount Sinai, Moses was given the 10 Commandments. Now in our Old Testament reading for the day, Moses is given a breathtaking look at the promised land from the top, Mount Pisgah. It seems complete, doesn't it? Moses' life was successful. It was meaningful. But of course, you and I are not Moses. And for Moses, there was only one goal: to reach the promised land. But a glimpse is all that he's given. The fact of the matter is that Moses is not granted fulfillment of his life's goal. Do you think his life felt empty? Without meaning? If we could, we would write a different ending to the story, but we cannot. Death comes and closes the book before we've had a chance to write a final chapter. There's so much that's unfulfilled in our lives. Sometimes it threatens to overwhelm us and choke our lives with regret. All of us, like Moses, have to come to terms with the incompleteness of our lives. How fitting of Martin Luther King Jr. to evoke this story in his last sermon. I've been to the mountain. I've seen the promised land. Even if I don't get there with you, I've been to the mountaintop. King died outside the promised land of racial justice. In these days of shootings by white supremacists, that promised land seems further and further away. He never got there. We haven't got there. Was King's life meaningless? If we could, we would write a different ending to the story. This is, for Paul Tillich, the great anxiety of modernity, of what we're in right now. The fear that our lives ultimately hold no meaning because death exposes all that we are unable to accomplish, to learn, to love, to be. Well, thank God for Jesus, who, when asked what made our lives truly fulfilled, did not instruct us to be rich by the time we're 30, famous by the time we're 40, powerful by the time we're 50, and venerated by the time we're 60. Instead, he gave us a very simple instruction, an instruction of one word, really. You know what that word is? Love. Love. Love God. Love yourself. Love your neighbor, meaning everybody else. That was the instruction Jesus gave us, a lifestyle of love that can carry us through our life's ending without sorrow, without regret. Here's my new favorite quote about dying. When it comes time to die, make sure that all you have to do is die. The only way to make sure of that is to live every day as though it were your last. Those words were spoken by Jim Elliot, a missionary who lived a life based on love. He died at the age of 28. Was his life a success? Did it hold meaning? Maybe accepting the fact that there is no happily ever after, no arriving at the promised land in our lives, maybe that can be a step towards wisdom and real meaning. So let me suggest that the word to you today from the ending of Moses' life in the book of Deuteronomy is relax. RELAX, to quote one of my favorite overachievers. God's purposes for this world are not utterly dependent on you getting it right. When your life's meaning is about love and not about success, then you can go ahead and live it. And let go when you don't arrive where you planned. You can venture out even when you don't achieve your life's goals. Moses could tell us sometimes the trip itself is more interesting than its destination. Go ahead and love, bet your life on somebody, even with second thoughts. Have children, even when the ones you get aren't the ones you thought you wanted. Moses could tell us that only God knows where it all leads, what it all finally means. We are the story that God writes. God only knows how it ends. So whether you achieve all your goals, make progress, or arrive at your planned destinations, when you live a life based on love, here is the promise. As with Moses, God goes with you all the way to your final day. And at the last, God will write the ending. Amen.